To Break Down the Walls. Written by Skywolf666 and read by Goombasa. Pit is back! Any sense of decorum or status had fled the emerald-haired goddess completely as she hurried across the hall to the doorway where her hero was waiting for her after his safe extraction from the underworld. She knew Viridi was following on her heels, also relieved to see that Pit had made it back safely, even if she wouldn't say so aloud, but she had a difficult time caring about the goddess of nature. Her focus, her world, had been sharpened to a single point, and that was the return of her angel who had freed her from a hell she hadn't known existed when her body had been taken over. Palutena's breath caught in her throat as she reached the entrance and saw him for the first time with her own eyes since she had sent him to Pit 2 at the spring. Blood and dirt speckled the remains of his shredded tunic, and he still had several smudges of ash across his face, chest, and in his hair, but to her, he still looked as handsome as he would on any other day. Her muscles seized up and brought her to an abrupt stop as the white fluttering of his wings, fresh, new, and unhurt, caught her gaze. The force of her relief was violent, and she was well aware that if Viridi hadn't been there, she would have collapsed on the spot and sobbed her gratitude aloud to the heavens. His brilliant, sapphire eyes widened as he saw her, and for a moment she hesitated in going to him. It hadn't been enough that she had actually attacked him, that she had wounded him. The Chaoskin had used her to throw the cruelest words at him as well. The insults rang out repeatedly within her mind, making her cringe with guilt, and she wondered how she could ever hope to apologize to him. She had done the unforgivable to him 1,000 times over, and 1,000,000 times over to the world, and she doubted she would ever be able to atone for any of it. Then he smiled, an awkward, boyish, and earnest grin that wiped away any and all of her doubts and fears the second it spread across his face. He rubbed at his cheek self-consciously, trying to rid himself of some of the ash that stained his skin, but his gaze never left hers. The relief in his eyes was at war with his joy, but for all of his bubbling emotion, he didn't seem inclined to move toward her. Instead, he stood where he was, taking her in from a distance, as if that was more than enough for him. It wasn't, however, for her. Not after everything that had taken place in the past 3 years, in the past 3 weeks. She had seen him hurt so many times before, had welcomed him home after too many long battles, where they both had thought it was the end of the line, but this time was different. It was her who had nearly been lost, and it was her who had been powerless, and even when the rest of the world turned against her, he had refused to leave her side. No, it was certainly not the same, and the distance was far too much for her now. Overwhelmed with emotion, and needing to act on it before she came apart at the seams, the Goddess of Light hurried toward the stairs to him. He stepped forward immediately, that grin widening for every foot of space that was closed between them, and the walls she had built between the two of them began to crack. All notions of duty, obligation, and order vanished from her mind as she took him in, healthy and whole, and without a word she pulled him forward and into her arms for a fierce embrace. Pit stiffened, shocked by the display of affection, and his face reddened sharply as he heard Viridi cackling somewhere from above them. His first instinct was to pull away, stammering and protesting, but he felt his goddess trembling as she pressed him tightly to her, and he couldn't leave her in such a way without doing something about it. Awkwardly, but earnestly, Pit wound his arms around her waist and returned the pressure she gave to him, and his heart skipped several beats when he felt her warm exhale on his ear. He knew, though she never would have said it aloud, that she had been scared. Whether or not it was for herself or for him, Pit knew that what had happened had terrified her beyond reason. She wasn't holding him simply because she was relieved to see that he was okay, but because she needed to remind herself that he was real, and that she was no longer trapped in a nightmare. Her fingers curled around his bare back, clinging to him, and Pit hated himself for being unable to help her sooner. Viridi's words of how much she had to have suffered resisting the Chaoskin for 3 whole years made him grip her closer, as if his embrace could banish the experience entirely. The sounds of her pain, the way she had gasped before collapsing to the ground when that horrid creature had been forced from her body, made him shiver all over, and he knew for a fact that experience for her was much worse than his own. He had never seen her display such weakness before, had never seen any god truly be struck down in such a way, and to know that he, Pitu, and Viridi had been the only things standing in the way of her demise shook him to the core. "It's okay, Lady Palutena." Pitt's voice was soft in her ear, soothing and kind, and Palutena closed her eyes tightly as she took comfort from him. She knew words didn't matter to them at that moment, because no one else knew her the way he did. She could bluster and smile all she wanted, but her captain could see underneath her shields with little more than a glance. Her fears, her concerns, her pain were all there on display for his eyes, and though part of her pride rankled to be such an open book to anyone, he was Pitt, and there was no one else she would rather have in his place. "Ahem." Viridi's not-so-polite cough broke through their moment like a crack of thunder, and in embarrassed surprise, both goddess and angel leapt away from each other abruptly. The goddess of nature was smirking as she came down the stairway slowly, clearly savoring the fact that she had been able to see such a thing and have their weakness now in the palm of her hand. She was not surprised by the sight, but after the way she had seen Pitt fight so hard for his goddess, or how Palutena had dropped all pretenses and held her angel close to her heart when he had been so gravely injured. There was more than devotion there, far more, and even though the sight was beautiful in its own way, Viridi could not help but comment with a broad smirk, "Sorry to ruin your moment, but actually scratch that, I'm not really sorry. You guys are the rude ones for forgetting all about me being here, even if you were preoccupied by each other." "Viridi?" Pitt stammered angrily at the implication that lay beneath her words, and his ears burned with a mixture of embarrassment and shame. He shook his head furiously from side to side, annoyed but not entirely surprised that Viridi would take every chance she could to bully him or Palutena, even with what they had gone through together. They had fought just as hard against each other, and that experience, even 3 years past now, was not going to be relieved with a single olive branch. "Mind your own business." "Watch it, Pitt. I am a goddess, and there's only so much backtalk I'm going to take from you," Viridi warned him with one raised eyebrow, and despite her diminutive size and childlike appearance, Pitt had to acknowledge that her power radiated from every inch of her being. She wasn't surprised by his attitude, nor when he was jumping to Palutena's defense, but she did admit she was impressed with the dichotomy of his servitude and willingness to disrespect other gods. He made no sense to her at the best of times, an angel who'd fight back the pantheon alone if he had to, but she did know that it was that personality quirk of his that made her respect him. Begrudgingly. "I'm only being nice because of what happened, and don't expect that to continue. I have my own affairs to tend to now, so I'll be on my way. Now that you two are back together, I shudder to think of what's going to be next for the rest of us." Pulling a face, Pitt wasn't entirely sure how to answer that, but he had no need as the goddess snapped her fingers and simply disappeared in a whirlwind of autumn leaves. Her laughter filled the untouched inner chambers, loud, cheerful, and full of vitriol that seemed a bit too gentle, as she called out across the heavens and to their ears, "Put a muzzle on your angel for the next time we meet, Palutena. He talks too much for a servant. And remember, this isn't over, not by a long shot. I'll prove that the goddess of nature can beat down the goddess of light any day." Shaking her head a little at the boast, but still hearing the change of that note in Viridi's tone, Palutena wasn't surprised by the flickering of fondness she felt in her chest. Enemy or not, Viridi had earned her respect long ago, and that was only compounded by the role she had played in aiding Pitt when she had been unable to do so herself. It was an odd relationship, almost like a friendly rivalry, but Palutena had dealt with much worse, and she didn't think it entirely a horrible thing at the end of the day. "Matt Viridi." She turned back to the angel at her side and was surprised by the look on his face as he studied the spot where Viridi had vanished from. A handful of leaves lay innocuously on the marble floor, and as out of place as they looked amongst the columns, Palutena had a suspicion that he wasn't bothered by the evidence that another goddess had been there. Rather, he didn't really seem to be looking at them, but instead beyond them, and a frown had furrowed its way onto his face while his hands clenched into tight fists. Concerned by the change in his mood, especially when things had finally seemed to return to normal, Palutena reached out gently to place her hand on his shoulder. Though he looked like he had been through the underworld, and in many ways he had, She knew there were no wounds on him after the visit to the springs. Something else was troubling him, and she hated to see it, when he had every reason to smile and rejoice for what he had accomplished. She spoke quietly, not wanting to startle him from his thoughts, but still wanting an answer. "Pitt? What's wrong? Please, angels cannot truly know gods." The dismissive words, the cruel and laughing tone that had thrown them so callously at him, cut through him, and before Pitt could stop himself, he stepped back and away from her. He could feel her surprise as her hand hovered on the empty air for a brief moment, but he turned his face away from hers and to the floor so he wouldn't have to see her expression. He felt cold suddenly, cold and small, as he took another step away from her, and Viridi's laughing comment of him as a servant only made him wish he could collapse in on himself and disappear. "These are goddesses you're talking to here, Pitt. Watch your tone." It didn't matter that he had dismissed Vociferous shortly after he had scolded him for his speaking above his station, or that the Chaoskin had been the one throwing the words at him through his goddess's voice. There had been truth inside those insulting words, and he had been reminded of his place too sharply for him to ignore it now that Palutena was safe. He spoke quietly, keeping his gaze on the ground, and wishing that he had never allowed himself to think he was anything more than an angel when she had pulled him so fiercely into her arms a few minutes before. "I'm glad to see you're okay, Lady Palutena. I'm home." Palutena didn't move or speak for a long instant, and the euphoria that had been singing through her minutes ago as she held Pitt close to her died down under a sickening sort of understanding at his rejection of her touch. She had never seen him so docile before, not in this way, and she had never expected him to push her away for any reason, but the pain flickering across his face made her remember that she had no right to feel hurt for being unwelcome. She had been the one to throw the first stone, after all, and she couldn't ever lay blame on him after everything she had said and done. He had every right to respond to her in such a negative way after the initial rush died away and quiet thought came back to take its place. She was wise enough to know that, as she cared enough for him to accept it, even if it made her ache. She had failed in her duties as a goddess, and had hurt the people she had been supposed to care for. The world had become battered and scarred because of her, and there was absolutely nothing she could do that would ever atone for her misdeeds. She had slaughtered so many innocents, had ignored their cries and her duties, and had hurt the one she cared for most, even when he refused to believe it had been her responsible. Though it hadn't been her speaking, she still knew exactly what it was she had said to him, and she knew no amount of apologies would ever heal those wounds. Pressing a hand to her heart, as it broke with the force of her guilt and self-loathing, Palutena fought back her tears as she followed his example and stepped back and away from him. The distance was painful, and it seemed so much larger than it really was, but she gave it to him, and she knew it was what he wanted. Bowing her head to hide the moisture in her eyes, and hating herself even more than ever for feeling pain when he was the one who hurt, Palutena couldn't stop her voice from breaking as she murmured, I'm sorry, Pitt." The words surprised Pitt, and he looked up in confusion. But now she was the one looking away from him. There was something remarkably frail about her suddenly, as if, even with the freedom of her soul, that she was still somehow broken, and his hand twitched at his sides as he wished to instinctively reach out and steady her. He didn't move, though, reminding himself that he had no right, and his teeth gritted together as he wondered why he had forgotten something so simple when she had embraced him. Then Palutena continued, and there was a heartbroken quality to her voice as she turned somewhat away from him and wrapped an arm around her middle like she wished to protect herself somehow. Her eyes remained on the floor, like his had done moments beforehand, and her expression was pinched as she shook her head a little and spoke shakily. "I can never atone for what I've done. I failed the humans who needed me, and I failed you. You who fought so hard to save me despite everything. I can't put into words how sorry I am for all of this, and I know that no matter how much I apologize, it will never take back what happened. But all the same, I'm so sorry, Pitt." Pitt gaped at her, at the anguished sincerity that saturated her tone, until he knew, even if he couldn't see her eyes, that she was fighting back tears. Horror filled him as he wondered if it was his fault, but he couldn't speak as she shook her head again, as if she was denying what she had just said in dismissive disgust. A bitter smile curled at her lips, looking so out of place on her beautiful features that he wanted to scream. She studied the fallen leaves on the marble floor with new eyes, and she spoke slowly, almost like she was forcing herself to get the words past her lips. "Verity was good to you. She gave you what I couldn't, and I know that she cares for you even though she denies it. The two of you were marvelous together in battle, and you accomplished much together. I wouldn't object if you wish to enter her service now that all of this has happened. I failed you, Pitt. I said such horrible things to you. I can't in good faith keep you at my side when I know I've done so much wrong. I don't want you to suffer any more at my hands. You are free to leave me if you so desire it." "Leave you?" Pitt repeated with widening eyes, and for a heart-stopping moment, the angel lost his breath and wondered if perhaps he hadn't been revived at the spring and was instead trapped in the underworld being tortured by Hades for eternity for daring to fight back against him. He couldn't imagine being parted from her side, not after everything he had done to rescue her, and the very idea that she would release him from her service was nearly enough to break him. He asked weakly, his voice trembling, as he knew if she sent him away, he wouldn't have to follow her orders despite not wanting to do so because he was an angel. Are you really going to send me away?" Palutena didn't answer, merely continued looking away, and he felt his heart catch as he wondered if she was considering making her offer into an order. The guilt on her face said everything her words didn't, and the realization that she was suffering because of what the Chaoskin had done to him rather than to her finally unlocked his silence. The spirit that had forced him forward roared to the surface again, against any and all misgivings, and he didn't fight it this time as he understood something. Anything had to be done before they were broken apart by their own hands rather than an enemy's. Pitt stepped forward, shaking his head angrily, before he threw out a hand, as if he could forcibly strike down her words and her fears with nothing more than that gesture. She turned at once at the sound, eyes widening in surprise at the uncharacteristic mask of angry defiance on his face, but he gave her no chance to speak as he exclaimed passionately, "No, no! I don't want to leave you, Lady Palutena, never! What the Chaoskin said, what I did, what the Chaoskin said, what it did, I know that wasn't you. I always knew it wasn't you. You're kind, you're good, and I know you care about the humans and about the Centurions. You would never say or do such cruel things on your own. You're the goddess of light. You're everything to the world and to me. I won't leave you. Even if you send me away, even if you order me away, I will never leave you ever again. My place is with you, nowhere else. Always." Palutena felt her heart catch inside of her chest at the earnest declaration that she had no choice but to believe, and a fierce warmth filled her from head to toe as she wondered how she ever had managed to survive without him at her side for 3 years. Even in open defiance of her will as a goddess, he was still remaining loyal to her, and her breathing stopped as the pure emotions of his tirade hit her like a physical blow. His sapphire blue eyes were blazing, as if he was daring her to reprimand him, and it unlocked everything she had been trying so hard to suppress since she had seen him alive and well in the depths of the water. He truly didn't blame her, not in the least, and the knowledge that even after all she had done to him, that he'd never leave her side both broke her heart and healed it simultaneously. What did I ever do to deserve him? The question she had been asking herself ever since she had woken up and seen him kneeling at her side, staring at her with such undistinguished fear and concern, rang out loudly in her mind and freed her body. The emotions that had been strangling at her heart needed an outlet, and she couldn't contain them any longer, as she stared at his desperate face and knew that her own selfishness would never allow for her to order him away. She needed him too much to ever imagine being parted from him, and she couldn't deny that part of her any longer. Pitt looked as if he was fully ready to continue, to argue until he was hoarse, and she finally conceded and promised that she wouldn't let him leave her. She cut off his words before he could speak again by reaching out gently, firmly placing a finger over his lips. He jumped at the contact, and a blush shot across his cheeks immediately, but she didn't care, as she caressed his cheek and angled his face just a little up to hers. There was something in her emerald gaze that he had never seen before, something stirring underneath the tears of shame and gratitude that were shining in her eyes that he couldn't quite name. His tongue felt heavy in his mouth, locking him into silence, and then she was leaning, whispering like the softest of a summer breeze, "That's enough, Pitt." His feet grew roots as her left hand joined her right and cupped his face, and Pitt had no time to think about it as she kissed him. He numbly felt his arm lifting on its own, and he wasn't entirely sure what it was doing as he tried to digest the fact that Palutena was pressing herself against him like she never wanted to draw away. His hand settled on her throat, fingertips ghosting around the creamy skin like she was made of glass and would shatter if he dared to touch her any more strongly. Then he closed his eyes and surrendered, pressing back in response as instinct took over and shattered his better sense. Palutena felt an electric thrill go through her as he answered her kiss, and without thought, she urged him forward with a low murmur of longing. He obeyed her will at once, and his entire body quivered as his tongue ran along her lower lip before entering her mouth. Pitt's arm wrapped fiercely about her body, pulling her close when she couldn't suppress a gasp of surprise, and he crushed her to him with all the strength she hadn't expected, but delighted in nonetheless. He had grown so much stronger than she had given him credit for as her own arms wrapped around his neck, and a sinful voice whispered in the back of her mind that her angel was a boy no longer. She broke away first, hating to do so, but needing the air, and then she heard him gasp her name against her lips. It was a wild sound in a rough voice, full of surprise and yearning and love, and it succeeded in doing what nothing else could. The last of the walls came crumbling down, the rift closed up with a sudden surge, and Palutena succumbed to it all willingly. Her hands yanked at him, pulling his face desperately back to hers, and she heard herself moan as their lips found each other again. "Oh, Pitt." The sound his name being uttered in such a breathless way undid him, and Pitt again felt his limbs moving without his consent. He pushed her into the nearest column, pinning her against the stone with his own body, and a feral part of him that he didn't know he possessed growled savagely in satisfaction when she responded by pushing back just as eagerly. He could barely believe he was being so rough with her, with his goddess, but reason ceased to matter as her fingers curled hungrily in his hair and demanded more of him. She tasted sweet, like that ambrosia she had always said filled the drinks of the gods, and Pitt knew nothing but that he never wanted to stop savoring that flavor. Palutena's hands slid down his back, caressing the familiar planes of his form that only hours ago she had been clutching desperately to her chest as if she prayed for him to live. She had marveled then how much he had grown, how strong he had become, and had wondered when the brown-haired angel had matured without her notice. He had suffered through so much, too much, and any and all dreams of innocence could no longer possibly be his to claim. She had put him through more than she could ever accept, and she hated herself even as she stroked his wings and wished she had never had to see them burnt. Yet, as he hesitated to return her caresses, his kiss softening as he became timid under her ministrations, Palutena had to smile. Perhaps not all innocence had completely been wiped from him, but she didn't much mind. He would hardly be her Pitt if he didn't stumble so often and so earnestly. Allowing her desire to cool, knowing that she should hold back regardless, Palutena inhaled slowly and let her heartbeat calm as they parted again. She had pushed him further than she had meant to, and the last thing she wanted was for him to think he had to ask permission, or that his body was all that she wanted. Meeting his eyes and reading the uncertainty in them, Palutena couldn't resist the urge to lazily run her fingers through his unruly chocolate-brown curls in a comforting gesture. His stiff posture relaxed a little under her touch, and he was blushing handsomely, as if he was just now realizing what they had been doing. The idea that he was shocked by his own instincts amused her greatly, and she had to fight back a wicked grin as she was reminded of how often she had teased him for being naive in the ways of the world. It was his best quality, that wholehearted purity, and she cherished it dearly, as she reassured him quietly. "It's all right, Pitt. You don't need to ask for anything from me. Do what you feel is right." Staring at her, as if he couldn't believe her words, Pitt didn't move for a handful of seconds, as he stared up at her with wonder. She smiled at him, gently, ever so gently, and he understood that she was just letting him break down their walls. But she was also apologizing for putting them up in the first place. She ceded to him in this because she didn't want to assert herself as his goddess, because she wanted him to be her equal. And the thought made his mind spin as forbidden images beckoned at the strange, wild part of him that he still didn't quite understand. However, when Pitt finally reached out, he dismissed that part of him, even though it made his body burn with disappointment. There were more important matters for him to put first, and if she was giving him leave to do what he wanted, he wasn't about to let the chance go to waste. He lifted his head, slowly but without hesitation, and then his fingertips brushed along the side of her face in the lightest caress he could possibly manage. Palutena started in surprise as his fingers caressed her cheek, and she felt a heat surge through her skin in response to the gentle touch she had not expected. He stared at her with undisguised longing and relief, and she wondered if this was what he had wanted to do when she had first opened her eyes and called his name. She imagined that he would, had secretly wished for it when he held his hand back automatically from her, and she cherished the tenderness that made his touch so absurdly sweet. She nuzzled into his palm as his fingers spread to cup her face, and she wrapped her own hand about his wrist to keep it there as she sighed contentedly. "Pitt, I missed you so much," Pitt said quietly, repeating the words he had told her so earnestly when he had finally gotten the chance to speak to her again. Her skin felt warm underneath his, and he savored the way a gentle pink blush raced underneath everywhere his fingers touched. It was new, seeing this awkwardly pleased side of her, and it gave him confidence as he realized that despite it all, she was actually as shy as he was when it came to overstepping what had used to be their boundaries. She watched him in silence, pain and apology flickering across her expression once more as he again stroked the shape of her cheek, and his words caught in his throat as he wished for the beauty he always saw in her smiles. So much." "I know," Palutena told him gently, not needing to hear him stumble for the words he wanted to say when his actions spoke so much louder than his voice. She had known for longer than she would ever admit what lay in his heart, and what lay in hers. She had never not seen underneath his bluster and cheeky smiles, and though she had known it was wrong, she had encouraged him because she had been too afraid to speak it aloud herself. Now, however, there was courage, not any kind she wished for, but she accepted it nonetheless, as she had answered him sincerely, "And I feel the same way." Blinking, Pitt looked like a stunned child as he looked up at her, as if he couldn't believe what she was saying. Then, a smile broke through the disbelief, wide, earnest, and euphoric, and Palutena couldn't stop herself from giggling at the joy she'd brought to him with only 6 words. The arms that had been wrapped almost forgotten about her waist tightened, and then he hugged her fiercely, laughing aloud as he wished he could sweep her off her feet and into the air like she had done with him so many times before the power of flight. She returned his embrace with even more giggling, but the sound was music to his ears as he pulled away and asked for confirmation, even though he knew she'd never lie about such a thing to him. "Really?" "Of course," Palutena reassured him honestly, and her heart picked up speed inside her chest as a warm blush again made its way across her face. There was no turning back now. The words had been left out in the open, but she found the idea not nearly as frightening as it had been once before. The pedestal he had placed her on had collapsed, the walls between them were broken, and though she knew it would never quite be the same between them, she didn't mind. They had come through enough already to have confidence in each other, if not in themselves, and that would have to do. Pitt beamed up at her, the look of happiness so stark on his face that she couldn't help but smile back, and then he stood on tiptoe and pressed his lips to hers again in a chaste kiss. Warmth flooded her body as they held each other, reveling in the fact that they were both okay, that they both had finally made a leap, and he pressed his face against the silk of her dress before he whispered into it with every ounce of the devotion he felt for his goddess of light, "I think that I need to take back my wish now." Tilting her head in surprise, Palutena ran her finger again through his hair as she wondered what he meant. His wings, fresh, unhurt, white, fluttered gently against her arms, and she didn't resist the urge to trace the path of the nearest one's arc with her free hand's fingertips. Seeing them burnt had nearly killed her when she remembered all of the times he had spoken so eagerly of being able to fly under his own power, and she was puzzled now by him saying that he had to take it back. Nothing had ever been a sorer spot for him than being an angel incapable of flying on his own, but now there was a sense of contentment in him that confused her and forced her to ask him curiously, "What do you mean?" Looking up at her, smiling boyishly, yet with a strange maturity that truly made him handsome, Pitt allowed his wings to spread across his back so his goddess would truly understand what he meant with his words. He nodded a little, knowing full well that even though the jesting would never stop between them, he had reached a sense of peace where his powers of flight were concerned. His goddess let him fly, even when his feet were firmly on the ground. As he explained that for her with an impish laugh, "I don't need the power of flight to really fly. I don't even need wings for that. I have you. That's all I've ever needed." The words were so unexpected that Palutena couldn't find a proper answer, and the look of surprise she wore must have been amusing as Pitt started to snicker, and hard. The blush that had settled on her cheeks began to roam higher across her face, and she wondered how on earth he had ever learned to say such words so smoothly, and worse, actually bring her to a point of flustered delight at such simple flattery that she should have been used to accepting. The answer came quickly enough as she watched him laughing at her expense, hugging her close all the while because he wanted to, and she couldn't find it in herself to feel all that upset by being one-upped. It was his earnestness, his idealistic sense of honesty that had captured her heart, because he meant what he said, always. She returned his hug, hiding her smile as she nuzzled into his shoulder and squeezed tight, her heart singing gladly as she murmured to herself, "Well, I suppose I'll just have to get used to this, won't I? Huh, and I wouldn't have it any other way." The end.